Good afternoon. I hope this finds everybody healthy and safe. This is our last program of the semester. We'll resume again next semester. And we couldn't have a more important topic. It's been titled Golden State on Fire, the Science, Law, and Policy of Wildfire in California. After we've experienced this year and in recent years, it's so important we focus on this topic. We have three terrific speakers, and I'll introduce them in the order in which you'll be hearing from them. Again, I apologize to them that the biographies don't begin to do justice to all of their accomplishments, but I want to be able to turn to their remarks as quickly as possible. The first speaker will be Scott Stevens, who's a professor in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management here at UC Berkeley. Professor Stevens teaches and conducts research, wildland fire science, fire ecology, forest policy, and forest management. He's particularly focused on the interactions of wildland fire and ecosystems. This includes how prehistoric fires once interacted with ecosystems, how current wildland fires are affecting ecosystems, and how future fires and management may change these interactions. He's also interested in wildland fire and forest policy and be proved to meet the challenges of the next decades, how fire will be affected by climate change. Professor Stevens has testified for the United States Congress on fire policy, and he's been deeply involved in California's efforts to address fire. He received his BS in electrical engineering from Sacramento State University and his PhD in wildland resource science from UC Berkeley. The second speaker will be Patrick Gonzalez. He's an associate adjunct professor in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management here at UC Berkeley. He's also the principal climate change scientist for the United States National Park Service. He's a forest ecologist and climate change scientist who advances action on human-caused climate change through scientific research, revealing new insights on ecosystem impacts and carbon solutions. He helps local people, national parks, and policymakers use the scientific results to conserve nature and protect human well-being. He's conducted field research in Africa, Latin America, and the United States. He's published in such prestigious journals as Science, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, and elsewhere. He's the lead author of 4 reports on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The organization awarded a share of the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. He received his BS in Natural Resources from Cornell, an MS in Environmental Engineering from Stanford, and a PhD in Energy and Resources from UC Berkeley. And the third speaker was my colleague, Professor Eric Bieber, and I have to thank Professor Bieber for his role in putting together this panel. He is the Edward C. Hallback Jr. Professor of Law. His teaching and research interests are environmental law, natural resource law, energy law, land use law, federal Indian law, administrative law, and property. Prior to joining the Berkeley Law faculty in 2006, he worked as a litigator in the Denver office of Earth Justice, a public interest nonprofit specializing in public lands and other environmental cases. Among many other things, he is the co-director of the Cannabis Research Center at UC Berkeley, which examines the environmental, regulatory, and economic implications of legalized cannabis production in California and elsewhere. He's also the principal investigator for Getting It Right, a joint research project between Berkeley Law and the Columbia Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. Professor Bieber earned his undergraduate degree from Harvard College, a master's in environmental science with a focus on conservation biology from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, and a law degree from Yale Law School. After graduating from law school, he clerked for Judge Carlos Lucero on the 10th Circuit, Judge Judith Rogers on the DC Circuit. And with those introductions, I'll turn it to Professor Stevens. As always, please feel free to send in your questions and answers. The panelists will leave plenty of time at the end to try to answer them. Professor Stevens.
Well, thank you very much. I'm thrilled to be here to be able to share some information that I hope might be interesting and also generate some questions. Nice to meet you all virtually. So today I was going to spend a little time talking about fire and forest restoration in California. So I'm going to show you some research that we've done at Berkeley, also show you some actual work on restoration topics, including prescribed burning. And again, I'm just trying to set the stage of some of the tools that we have possibly at our disposal to address some of the issues today. So if you look at some of the early writings in United States and California in particular, we have some really interesting accounts. And here's one from 1924, show on Kotok. California pine forests represent broken, patchy understock stands worn down by the attrition of repeated light fires. Next. Extensive crown fires are almost unknown in the California pine region. That's pretty amazing if you think about what's happened in the last 20, 30 years. And the virgin forest, subjected to repeated surface fires for centuries, has been exposed to cumulative risk. The little picture there on the lower left is a Bear Creek Guard Station in the Plumas National Forest, pretty close to our UC Berkeley Forestry Summer Camp that was started in 1917. And you can see a very open stand structure there, shrubs on the ground, big old ponderosa pine. I think those are basically the conditions that Shao and Kotok wrote about in 1924. I want to show you just a little data. I'm not going to show you too much data, but here's a interesting form, USDA Form 321A. What it is an archived form of an early forest inventory done in 1911 in the Stanislaus National Forest and parts of Yosemite National Park. What this has is actually species information. Right on the top, we see a YP for yellow pine, second column sugar pine, center column white fir. And this is actually the data recorded in an inventory based on the public land survey system. Amazingly, we went back and were able to remeasure these spots after many decades. And I'll show you some information on that in a moment. These are a couple places that we've done this on in the Southern Sierra, in the Kern National Forest, which is today called the Sequoia National Forest, the Stanislaus National Forest, and we've even got two new data sets that are on this map, one on the El Dorado and one up actually near Mount Lassen in the Southern Cascades. I want to show you this slide just simply to say that these are big areas. You know, it's one thing to work on 50 acres, maybe, or 30 acres, but you can see the cumulative areas that these surveys represent are in the tens of thousands of acres, 40,000, 28,000 acres. And it was a 3% sample of these areas, which is actually quite high from a statistical standpoint. So these are large areas that can maybe help us understand a little bit more about what actually has changed. Here's a slide that just shows some comparison of data. So you see the 1911 and the 2013. 2013 is when we remeasured it. And I'll look at the density of forest, tree density. That's just a number of trees per acre, above 6 inches, and the other column above 36. One thing is a little interesting is the number of trees above 36 inches, at least in the survey here, pretty much the same. So we see relatively small number, but some big trees. But you see the other column there, the number of trees above 6 inches, 22 versus 101. That's a dramatic change. And we know that if you take fire out of an ecosystem that used to operate every 7, 10, 15 years, both from indigenous burning and lightning, that you're going to change these forests dramatically. And that's exactly what's happened. The picture on the right lower is actually a picture of one of the areas we remeasured. I was out there with the students for a few days, and that's one of those areas we remeasured in 2013. The picture on the lower left is actually a photograph of 1911 conditions. Again, somewhat similar to that previous one I showed you in the Bear Creek Guard Station. So that's some real quantitative data that shows us that there's been a dramatic change. Harvesting is also added to this. You take out the large trees over the decades, you create more space for small trees to establish, and then you allow fire to be removed, and then you get these trees to grow and actually densify the forest. It's exactly what we've seen. So what are we going to do about it? Okay, and that's what I want to show you next is, here's a study on our Blodgett Forest Research Station. This is one of UC Berkeley's research forests. And what we did is we did a study starting in 2001 where we decided to do some treatments in here to reduce fire hazards and increase restoration using both mechanical methods without any burning, mechanical methods like thinning followed by burning, and then using fire alone with no pre-treatment at all, 3 prescribed fires. Each unit's around 50 acres in size, and they were randomly assigned. So let's take a look at a sequence. So this one is the mechanical only treatment. So this is in 2001, right when we just about started the study. And this is a mixed conifer forest, typical forest in the Sierra Nevada, Combers, the Southern California mountains, the Klamath Mountains. This is just a very typical, I'd say, structure today in mixed conifer. And I want you to watch that California black oak in the upper right-hand corner. That's going to be the vantage point when we actually watch the sequence go forward from 2001 onward. So here, I'm going to show you the machine. This is a masticator that actually comes in and reduces tree density on the small trees, the trees that we can't send to the sawmill or other economic purposes. So this machine only does 2 acres a day. It costs about $1,000 an acre to run this machine. So after we did both the thinning and then the mastication, here's that same photo point, and there's the California black oak over in the right-hand corner. And you see we've reduced tree density, but we've also deposited more fuel in the ground because of the mastication and also the materials that were left after commercial harvest. Let's go forward from the same point, 2003, 2010. Now we start to see the understories develop, trees are regenerating. The masticated fuel bed is largely decomposed already, which surprised us, frankly, in a place like the Sierra Nevada, which has dry summers. And we go 2015, we see the same tree in the right corner. Understory continues to develop, showing us that we're seeing changes to the forest structure and actually reduction in the ability of this stand to withstand wildfire. So what do? We come back in 2019 and we do another harvest and another mastication. And this is what it looks like today. Turns out this is a really effective forest structure for things like climate change, fire, insects, drought. It's a much more resilient condition. We've done tree ring studies on this and a host of other things on soils and other aspects. So this is the outcome of about 20 years of restoration in the Sierra Nevada with mechanical systems. I want to show you one more set of photos. This time we're only going to use fire. So there's a tree at Big Sugar Pine dead center. That's a condition, again, that's very typical. About 35 tons of forest fuel on the ground, dead and down woody material. Tree densities probably around about 250 to 300 trees per acre. This place hasn't burned since around 1895 because of fire suppression and exclusion. Now we're going to burn it. Here's a picture of our prescribed fire at night, burning in that exact unit. You see a lot of sparks coming off this thing, and you see some of these trees torching. When you're on a fire at night, sometimes you wonder why the whole world doesn't burn down, because there's so many sparks coming off these fires. And it turns out relative humidity is high enough at night and temperature low enough that we almost have no problem with spotting outside of our unit. Here's the same tree after one fire. You can see the surface fuel has been reduced. A lot of the standing trees that are small are dead now, but they're still standing, of course. We haven't consumed them with this burn. So let's go forward. Here we got 2003, 2009. Some of those trees we killed initially are starting to come down. We see some shrub response. So what do? We burn it again. Here's a second prescribed fire ignited right at that same tree position. After the second fire, this is what it looked like. Here we have, again, surface fuels consumed, shrubs reduced. Some of those small trees that had come down are burned up. Let's go forward again, 7 years. More of those trees that have died, both in the subsequent fire and also the original fire. And we see a shrub response as well. So what do? We burn it again. Third fire that we put into this stand. And then this is kind of what it looks like today. So at the end of the day, after these 3 fires over about 20 years, we've got a very desirable forest structure, one that I think can deal with climate change, fire, insects, drought, and other aspects. It's not to say it's going to be perfect against those, but it's going to be sustainable and I think resilient. And this one just tells us a little bit about some of the papers. We've written 40 papers on this study now. We actually have a summary document that I'd be happy to share with anybody. And we find essentially very few really negative impacts. We did see a little bit of non-native herbaceous plants increase in some treatments, but other than that, soils, bark beetles, vegetation, songbirds, human survey of their impacts of what they thought the treatments did. We just see very little negative and a lot of positive outcomes here. Longevity of treatments, 15 to 20 years. That means you got to keep it going. Can't walk away ever, just like the indigenous cultures never walked away from their stewardship. And I think forest carbon is a little bit more complicated. We'd have to talk about that a little bit more. But we've done about 2 or 3, 4 papers on forest carbon, and actually that's an interesting story. It turns out it really depends on the annual probability of wildfire occurrence, which of those treatments actually has the potential to be the best. What about the problem? Well, this is almost my last slide. This is the problem. This is a slide that just shows amount of area in forest in the Sierra Nevada by the U.S. Forest Service. So essentially the center column, the center column is the amount of area that we think was burned historically in all forest types, and each forest type is actually a different color in that center column. So it's about 500,000 acres a year burned from indigenous burning and lightning. The little teeny column that you can barely see to the left is actually how much treatment we're doing as of 2010 annually. Pretty tiny, right? That is basically what we're doing with treatment. Then if we take this amount of treatment and take it forward, and we also say we need to retreat the areas that are treated every 15 to 20 years to get them in a maintenance phase, and we continue that for the next 30 to 40 years, this turns out to be the amount of forest area inside the Sierra Nevada National Forest that never gets treated. I call that a nightmare. That means you're bringing about 60% or more of the forest area forward in an era of changing climate, fire regimes, anthropogenic disturbance, and it's completely not capable to deal with those anthropogenic impacts. That's a real telling story. So that's why we got to do better on that other side, on the annual treatment. And here, essentially, my last slide, we know the forest structure has changed. We got the MOU from the governor and the Forest Service chief to say we want to get 1 million acres a year by 2025. Senator Feinstein has a bill she released in the US Senate about 2 months ago that I think has some promise. Senator Harris also released a bill. Her bill pretty much exclusively focuses on the wild and urban interface in fire. And Senator Wyden from Oregon also has a bill in the US Senate trying to increase the prescribed fire capacity in the US. I would say no doubt climate change makes this worse, but I still think there's things we can do today to really improve our ability to go forward and conserve forests. If we're talking about chaparral, talking about other ecosystems, it's a different story. You got to have a different conversation. But in frequent fire forest ecosystems in this state, we do have options. I say we got 1 to 2 decades to change this ship, and we're running out of time, but I'm still hopeful. I'm hoping that these efforts might actually pay for the future. And with that, I'll stop and thank you very much. I think I'll get to maybe potentially my job now is to introduce Patrick. So Patrick, I'll stop sharing and hopefully you can do. Thank you.
Okay, so do you see my screen?
Yes.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks to the Dean and to everybody for your interest. Burning flames towered above this home in Thousand Oaks, California, just as wildfire has overwhelmed much of the state and the Western US the past few decades. Sadly, many people have died. Wildfire is a natural process, but published scientific research shows, as Scott has showed you, that unnatural fuel accumulations from old policies and other research has shown human-caused climate change has combined with that to substantially increase wildfire across the Western US. So today I will briefly cover these issues in these 5 sections. And of course, the problem is global. This is a graph of carbon dioxide, the main greenhouse gas in the atmosphere for the past 800,000 years. And we see that it's shot up to its highest level in that entire period. Natural orbital cycles increase and decrease carbon dioxide in these cycles in the past, but this straight line at the end is all of human history from the Industrial Revolution to today. And so human activities have increased carbon dioxide to its highest level in 800,000 years. And that is primarily from burning fossil fuels. So this is the carbon budget for the most recent published year. Cars, power plants pump 10 billion tons of carbon into the atmosphere every year. Deforestation, mainly in tropical forests, adds another 1.5 billion tons. but oceans, forests, soil, global ecosystems can only naturally absorb 6 billion tons. The remainder, over 5 billion tons, goes up into the atmosphere, and it's that fundamental imbalance that causes climate change. Consequently, the carbon dioxide has intensified the greenhouse effect, and temperature has increased to its hottest level in 800 years based on weather station measurements in the black on the right there, and reconstructions from tree rings and sediment cores, the colored lines on the left. An analysis by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change of all the potential contributing factors to, or causal factors of the temperature increase, which is that top graph, shows that El Nino, volcanoes, solar cycles, an Atlantic Ocean cycle, all of these natural factors are cyclical. They go up and down, or they're periodic. The only factor that has gone up in a statistically significant way is pollution from cars, power plants, and deforestation. And so human activities have caused 98% of the increased heat of climate change. It's complete agreement of credible scientists on this conclusion. The net effect of this has been an increase of energy radiating down into the Earth system. And in effect, that increased heat is equivalent to burning a 100-watt light bulb over every square meter on Earth, day and night, every day, every year, continuously at the height of a tall person. That's a lot of energy. And what that energy has been doing primarily has been increasing the temperature of the Earth. Colleagues and I conducted the first spatial analysis at a fine spatial scale of the United States and the 421 US national parks. And the darkest oranges here are an increase of 2.5 degrees Celsius per century, or about 5 degrees Fahrenheit, up in Alaska and down in Southern California. Actually, the US national parks, the temperature has increased at twice the rate of the country as a whole, because parks are located in extreme environments. And that's that graph in the upper right there. Let's zoom in more on California, the subject of today's webinar. And we see that some of the highest increases in temperature due to anthropogenic climate change have occurred in California, mainly in Southern California, but also in the northern Sierra Nevada and the Cascades. The darkest oranges there are, again, up to 2.5 degrees per century, or about 5 degrees Celsius, 5 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, so zooming back out to the US, this is the trends. This map shows the trends in total annual precipitation, and the darkest blues are an increase of 50% per century, and the darkest browns are a decrease of 50% in a century. And again, here we see actually California is disproportionately affected by increased aridity due to climate change. Most of the rest of the country, as you see, 4/5 of the country has experienced increases in precipitation, and that's because climate change is basically an increase of energy into the atmosphere, which creates more convection, more storms, and more rainfall. But patterns vary spatially, and we see this in California. So zooming in, you can actually see it more closely. Going down a decrease of up to 80% per century, mainly in the Mojave and in Southern California there, but also decreases in the Sierra Nevada and the Central Valley. Okay, so that was the climate. I'm now going to show you evidence of the impacts of those changes in climate on wildfire in Western North America. And this evidence has gone through the two scientific procedures. The first is detecting a change that's statistically significantly different from natural variability. And second, an attribution of the causes of that detected change through analyses that compare anthropogenic climate change with non-anthropogenic climate change factors. So human-caused climate change has intensified the heat that drives wildfires and increasing fire season length on 1/4 of global vegetated area up to a month in California. And that intensified heat has created this astounding, contributed to creating this astounding fire tornado just this past summer on the east side of Tahoe National Forest. The increased heat of anthropogenic climate change has combined with low precipitation. Precipitation mainly in California does not show a directional change for much of California. It bounces up and down, but the high temperatures in the past, since 2000 in the Southwest have combined with low precipitation to cause this drought that's the most severe since the 1500s, including this here in Bandelier National Monument and this dead one-seed juniper. Consequently, climate change has doubled the area burned by wildfire across the Western US above natural levels. Okay, so this graph here shows from 1984 to 2015, the burned area, and the yellow is the calculated burning without the climate change signal, and the orange is the additional burning on top of that natural burning, including the rim fire in 2013, which burned up into Yosemite National Park. The aridity of climate change has combined with those unnatural fuel accumulations that Scott showed to increase burned area across the Western US over 900%. And in California, the increase has been 800% for summer burning in that period. Just looking at the national parks and protected areas, climate has dominated other local human factors like population increase and human ignitions. So clearly, climate change has been driving much of the increase in wildfire in the U.S., and continued emissions of greenhouse gases could raise global temperature at the worst case, with highest level in 50 million years at that red line. But with emissions reductions, if we meet the Paris Agreement goals, we go along that blue line to the right there, and it increases a little, but it remains at below 1.5 to 5 degrees, 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius increase. And the implication for this is an increase in wildfire frequencies. Colleagues and I have analyzed up to a 50% increase across a third of global land. Focusing on the West, continued climate change could increase fire frequencies 5 times historical levels. And this is a photo of the campfire that burned up in Paradise in 2018. Leroy Westerling at the University of California, Merced has analyzed potential wildfire projections for California and climate change. The farthest right there, that highest emission scenario, fire frequencies potentially could triple, but lower emissions could actually limit those increases. Okay, so again, what climate change is doing, it's increasing the aridity and lengthening the fire season, and it could increase the number of extreme fire weather days 1 to 2/3. fire weather that created this astounding pyrocumulonimbus cloud this summer. Okay, so Scott talked about some adaptation measures generally, but these also serve to reduce risk under climate change, and primarily prescribed burning, and also managed wildland fire, or letting natural fires in wilderness burn. Scott had mentioned their research on carbon. A lot of the research shows that top diagram there is kind of the current situation of catastrophic wildfire and a catastrophic loss of carbon. But prescribed burning will facilitate low-level, high-frequency, low-severity fire along the ground and allow the big older trees to mature and store more carbon in the long term than is burned in the short term. So I have about 3 minutes left, and so I'll be zooming through to the end here. And Eric's going to talk more about policy, but it's just why aren't we burning more? As Scott showed, we're burning just a very small amount of what should be to restore ecosystems. And the U.S. government has allocated a disproportionate share to suppression rather than prevention, and for astoundingly expensive measures like the huge airplanes that have increased the budget to over $3 billion in 2018. Those are real dollars adjusted for inflation. So, both Scott and I and others have looked at the policy implications of this, and a policy shift from total fire suppression to proactive use of fire has so many benefits, but particularly reducing catastrophic wildfire under climate change. The fundamental solution to reduce catastrophic wildfire under climate change, though, is reducing the carbon emissions that cause climate change. And so I'll just in the last 2 minutes here, I'm going to go through this. And again, recall at the very beginning, I said most of the deforestation occurs in tropical forests. And so the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, recognizing this, has established a program to reduce emissions by conserving forests, by industrial countries who are parties to the treaty paying for forest conservation in tropical to tropical countries, and in that way protecting globally important stores of carbon that are now sovereign resources. Okay, and California actually protects the ecosystems with the highest carbon densities in the world, the coast redwoods, 2,600 tons per hectare, up to 10 times the density in tropical forests. And colleagues and I analyzed carbon across the state of California in the wildlands, and the carbon in the 27 national parks in California contain an amount of carbon equivalent to 1 year of carbon emissions from everybody in Los Angeles, Boston, all of those cities. That's a lot. That's 7 million Americans. But actually, it's not a lot because it's just 1 year of emissions. So in 1 year, those people can burn off the equivalent of all the carbon in the redwoods and the giant sequoias. So, and actually, our research showed that the 2/3 of the carbon coming from wildlands came from the 6% of the land that burned, and ecosystems are a net emitter in California, which has implications for the California Global Warming Solutions Act, which was relying upon ecosystems, but can no longer. Well, the past 4 years, the current administration has been denying science and blocking action on climate change. I should say the outgoing administration, right? Nevertheless, the US Climate Alliance of 24 states and Puerto Rico have banded together, and they pledged to meet the Paris Agreement goals cutting their emissions 16% through renewable energy, energy conservation, energy efficiency. And in fact, one piece of good news, and I am wrapping up, one piece of good news is that just last year in the US, renewable energy sources exceeded coal for the first time since the 1880s. And in California, we met our goal of cutting greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels 4 years early. So, and the IPCC has evaluated all of the carbon reduction measures and concluded that it is still feasible with concerted global action to meet the Paris Agreement goals. And all of that is up to you and up to me. 1 billion small sustainable actions can help solve the problem of climate change. Thank you. Eric, I will stop sharing.
Hi, great.
Professor
Thank
Bieber.
you, Patrick. So let me share my screen. Hopefully the right screen. Just need to find it. Sorry. Thanks very much, Patrick. Really appreciate that. And I'm going to focus in sort of building on what both Patrick and Scott talked about. I'm going to talk about law and policy issues here. And there's a wide range of policy options to deal with increased fire risks in California. And I'm going to focus in California, although there is a global issue here. And in the Q&A, we're happy to talk about the broader scientific policy and legal context more globally if people want. But just like the causes that Scott and Patrick articulated are rather complex, the policy choices are here as well. And I think we're going to have to do a lot of different things to be able to manage these risks. So the first one is really building on what Scott talked about, trying to restore fire to fire-dependent ecosystems who might try to manage level fire in natural and human-dominated landscapes where it's appropriate. And this is going to be particularly important, as Scott indicated, in ecosystems that have evolved with regular fire cycles. And those are significant portions of the landscape in California, including, as Scott mentioned, the pine forests in Sierra Nevada, oak woodlands across the state, chaparral, which is down in Southern California, as well as some up in the Central California. And this can involve either human-ignited management fires, what are often called prescribed burns, or they can be allow natural ignition fires to burn in wild areas, which is sometimes called wildland fire. So this option is relatively low cost to undertake. And from an ecosystem management perspective, it would be restorative. We're returning to fire patterns that these ecosystems generally evolved with. And we're generally present both with respect to Native American management pre-European contact, and even with respect to much management by European settlers in California before fire suppression really kicked in the early 20th century. But there are limits to how much we can rely on this approach. So many forested areas are so close to human communities that the risk of restoring fire is challenging, to say the least. There's also the challenge that if you have a high accumulation of fuel levels, you can't just easily restore fire to that system. You're going to have to do something to integrate fire in a way that reduces fuel levels so that the fire is going to be beneficial rather than harmful for your goals. And finally, there's significant legal and political risks to land managers who allow more fire on their lands. And I'm happy to talk about that in more detail in Q&A if people want. One of the big issues in terms of managing more fire on our lands is the air quality impacts that result. There is some evidence that smoke from prescribed burns is less dense and less widespread and less harmful than the smoke that comes from large-scale, high-intensity fires. But regardless, there's air quality impacts from burning. And those air quality impacts have in the past created significant regulatory barriers to prescribed burns on federal lands and private lands in California. Though many of those regulatory burdens have been reduced over the past several years, and that has made some progress. But even if we reduce the air regulatory barriers, we're still left with serious health implications in some contexts from the smoke from these fires. And this is particularly true in places across California. People can remember what it was like to be here in the Bay Area in September, but I want to focus in on the San Joaquin Valley in the southern Central Valley of California. This is an area with the worst air quality in the country. It has a lot of residents who are socioeconomically disadvantaged. And because of that, air quality problems have disproportionate burdens on them. Many of these people have less ability to avoid poor air quality, either because they have to work outdoors or because they don't have access to adequate filtration systems in their houses or where their workplace is. And they have less ability to get medical help for the respiratory problems caused by poor air quality. On the other hand, the San Joaquin Valley is in the same airshed as the Southern Sierra Nevada, which is one of the places where we most need to restore fire to the landscape, as Scott indicated. And if we don't restore fire, we're going to get fire there. It's just going to be much bigger and much harder and probably cause worse air quality problems in the long run. So it's not an easy trade-off to manage, but fire suppression is probably not the long-run solution here. Another option that Scott talked about is active management to reduce fuels. Aside from prescribed burns. So restoring fire can be challenging to do in areas that have a high buildup of fuel levels, because that buildup can increase the risk, as I said, that the fire can get out of control and cause damage. So one way to deal with that is to use active management to reduce the fuel levels in forests through the removal of small diameter trees, shrubs, and brush. Unlike prescribed burns, you can do this in close proximity to communities. You're not going to have a risk of something getting out of control and causing damage, and it won't have air quality impacts. As Scott noted, there may be regulatory obstacles to doing this. Some lawmakers have argued that strict environmental review and endangered species protections for management projects on national forest lands, plus the risk of lawsuits to enforce those standards, have interfered with the pursuit of the active management we need on the landscape at the scale that we need to do it at. There's, however, challenges here. As Scott noted in talking about the costs of doing some of these treatments, it can be quite expensive to undertake some of these management approaches. Now, one way to offset those costs is to also remove some of the large trees, the commercially marketable trees, as part of the projects, and get some money to offset the cost. But that, of course, one, provokes political resistance because people don't like their big, nice trees being cut down. But perhaps even more importantly, that might reduce the resilience of the forest to fire. As Scott indicated, it's often those large trees that are sort of the core of an ecosystem that's resilient to fire. They're resilient to fire themselves. And as Patrick indicated, that's the major source of carbon that's being stored by these forests. So the challenge with using active management is it's not clear that we can scale it up fully at the level we need, at least on its own, but it's probably a valuable component of an overall approach, particularly in areas close to communities in the area. I also do want to flag that if you do active management poorly, it can increase fire risks. So traditional logging activities that left a lot of residual wood on the ground, that's often perfect for burning and can cause real challenges. So you have to do it right, or else you're going to make the problem worse. Active management to reduce fuels can also be paired with subsequent prescribed burning, as Scott indicated, and that might often be a nice sweet spot in managing costs while also allowing you to introduce fire in landscapes that are otherwise too risky to do it now. And there's some research this can be quite effective. And lastly, there's community opposition to this kind of active management. For some people, this human engagement with forests and landscape like this is a matter of principle. They oppose it. They see it as, they believe in hands-off management. Or there's still a lot of suspicion that these kind of management projects are sort of cover for a commercial logging agenda being pushed by the timber industry. And I think those are kinds of distrust that is important to overcome. I think it's doable, but it's going to take a lot of work. And there are also going to be places where it's just not feasible, either because it's too remote or because of legal restrictions like in wilderness areas. We also have another range of approaches in terms of reducing vulnerability. We might try to change the location, nature, and pattern of development to reduce the vulnerability of communities to wildfire. So we might try to restrict or reduce further development in what's called the wildland-urban interface, often called the WUI by people in the field. These are the exurban and suburban areas that are built into forested and other fire-dependent landscapes. Think of the exurban suburbs in Southern California in the Chaparral Hills, or for instance, the development in the Sierra foothills around places like Sacramento. The problem is that these communities are often extremely vulnerable to fire. And in fact, their presence on the landscape, by creating additional areas where people and property are located, make it harder to restore fire to the landscape by increasing the risks of fire to damaging people and property. But this is really politically challenging to do. Telling people that they can't develop on their land or getting local governments to restrict development has been really challenging to make progress on. We might increase the resilience of new and existing construction to fire. You can impose stricter building codes on new construction at the cost of making new construction more expensive in a state where housing costs are already high. You could require retrofitting for existing buildings to make them more fire resistant. Some of that's cheap, some of that's expensive, and many of these homeowners or renters don't have access to funds to make that happen. You could also try to increase resilience of buildings to fire by changing their landscape and gardening around buildings. This is what's often called defensible space, where landowners remove plants, trees, other flammable materials that are right around their house in order to reduce the risk that a fire that comes through the neighborhood will actually ignite the fire on the house on fire. Now, that can be quite helpful, particularly for low to medium scale intensity fires. It may not work very well for high intensity fires. And in fact, we've seen this in some contexts where what are originally forest fires turn into urban fires where structures start catching on fire and then set other structures on fire. This is actually what happened in Paradise, the town of Paradise that was burnt, mostly burnt to the ground in the campfire 2 years ago. It was a structure to structure fire in a way that defensible space may not really protect well against. And on top of our constraints on building codes and land and defensible space rules, we may have subdivision rules, covenants and restrictions in by homeowners associations that prevent homeowners from doing those activities. We might also try to improve emergency planning and response to make it easier for communities to evacuate and respond to fire emergencies and reduce at least the loss of life from them. This was another major issue in the fire in the town of Paradise, where there was only one major access point out of the city, and there was a lot of traffic congestion during the fire, and that arguably contributed to the loss of life during the fire event. So again, the WUI is a key part of what we're trying to manage here, but as I just indicated, it's not an easy one to do in a lot of ways. We might try to reduce ignitions. Most fires are actually caused by human activity. One key component to this would be to reduce the fire risk caused by infrastructure, such as power lines. You could try to bury all your electrical power lines underground. That would be extremely expensive. You could also have utilities do a better job of managing the vegetation along their power lines to reduce the risk that power lines would set trees or other vegetation on fire in an extreme wind and heat event. That's expensive and time consuming, but probably more feasible than undergrounding. And then lastly, you can turn off electricity transmission and distribution systems when you have high fire risk. And you've seen that happen over the past couple of falls here in California in response to this increased fire risk. And that, of course, as you may have noticed, has its own problems, not just inconvenience, real economic costs, and in some cases for people who medically depend on the electricity, health risks as well. We could impose greater liability on the utility companies to try and force them to do better on managing their systems. Of course, one response is that we all benefit from the electrical system and the distribution system that electricity is delivered to us through. And so is this really a problem that the utilities are causing, or is this a broader social problem that maybe should be spread more equally across the state? And then you could also try to reduce human activity in areas that are vulnerable to fire. So this is the old educational approach of Smokey the Bear, tell people to put their campfires out, be aware of human activity and how it can affect fire risk in the landscape. And that can be important. And it's still true that a non-trivial number of major fires in California are started by poor maintenance of campfires, illegal campfires, people doing activities in the woods with fire and ignition sources. We might reduce public access to some remote areas because one of the biggest risk factors for ignition is just the presence of roads. And then lastly, as Patrick noted, climate change is a major driver for all of this. One of the challenges is that just as a global matter, California in its own isn't going to change global patterns on greenhouse gas emissions or climate change. So what we do in terms of climate change management in California is not going to appreciably affect our fire risk immediately. But what California can do is take a leadership position in this and demonstrate the political, legal, and economic feasibility of climate action, which I think the state has done quite well. And that can inspire other places around the world to take action. And that's the kind of concerted action we'll need to make a difference. And even with that, one of the challenges is there will be a certain amount of warming that's going to occur going forward just because of the nature of the global climate system and the greenhouse gases that are already in the atmosphere. And so even if we are very aggressive on climate change action, this is a problem that will continue. And so all the other things that we've been talking about will have to occur to manage the risks that we face. And I'll stop there. I hope, if nothing else, it was just, my point was to make clear there's a lot that we have to think about. This issue really connects to a wide range of topics, all of which I think have to be integrated and thought about, and there aren't going to be easy solutions here.
Thank all three of you for your terrific presentations. We do have a number of questions. I'll read them, starting in the order I got them. The first is, what is the intersection of health, healthcare, and addressing wildfire? Specifically, can you discuss the ways in which a labor force in diverse communities may be mobilized, including and covering in California, to address this challenge?
I think I talked about that a little bit in my presentation. I think air quality is a key issue in this context. And I do think it's, on the one hand, to address the air quality issues is one of the reasons we need to deal with fire and manage and create a way in which we can make fire more, avoid the catastrophic kind of fires that can create the worst smoke quality, air quality impacts. On the other hand, it's also true that if you're going to burn the ecosystems at the rate they need to burn, there's going to be a lot of fire in this state, and there's going to be smoke. And I think it's going to be really politically challenging for people to get comfortable with that. And I also think that that's going to raise real other health care issues we need to think about how do we, if that's going to be the case, what do we do to ensure that vulnerable populations and communities have access to what they need to be able to avoid harms from that air quality, the air quality impacts of that smoke. Patrick, go ahead if you had.
Yeah, one of the advantages of prescribed burning is that it is planned and it is less intense and less severe, as opposed to the catastrophic unforeseen wildfires that produce voluminous amounts of smoke in an unforeseen way. And so that just in itself is a potential benefit for human health.
Yeah, I just might add that you're right. I think you could plan these burns to take opportunity. And I agree with Eric that it still would be quite a bit of burning if we do this at the scale that is required. It was a year and a half ago, it was February of 2019. I remember it pretty vividly. No precipitation almost a whole month. That was crazy. It made me very nervous. Talk about a month for prescribed fire activity in a lot of places in this state, right? In the kind of middle of the winter. I think if we're going to do this work, we're going to have to take opportunities that climate change might actually provide for us because of differences in precipitation and patterns, because we're never going to do the burning we need just in the fall. So I think we are going to be looking more at the spring and the winter when chances are available, but it turns out we don't have a workforce to take an opportunity of that right now. Our fire workforce is seasonal, tied to the wildfire season. So we got to create a workforce actually to do this on periods outside of the wildfire and the edges of the wildfire season.
I'll read the next question. It's a bit longer. For Scott and/or Eric, when I try to convince my friends that the state of California needs more actively managed forests and wildlands, I'm often told that the feds own 47% of California and private parties own almost all of the rest. I realize that federal ownership makes management more complicated, but does it absolve the state of California of the need to more proactively manage forests and wildlands across the entire state? What is the state of California's appropriate role with respect to proactive management of fire dangers in federal lands, private lands, and state-owned lands?
Do you want me to take the lead on that, Scott, or? Yeah. All right, so with federal land, it's just tough. Federal law generally preempts state law. And the feds are there's been increasing cooperative work between the federal agencies and state agencies in this context over the past 15 to 20 years. But nonetheless, the federal government can choose to allow what it wants to allow on its lands or not. So I think there's a limited amount of what the state can do other than providing funding and offering to basically sponsor projects on federal lands when the federal government is willing to make it happen. On the rest of the land, it's a little more complicated. So most of the remaining land is privately owned. There are some state lands. The state of California does have a relatively stringent regulatory system for timber activity on private lands. It's actually one of the strictest regulatory systems in the country. And there is a ongoing debate about the extent to which that regulatory program interferes with the ability of private landowners to do the active management they want. On top of that, if you're a private landowner who wants to do prescribed burns, you're probably worried about the liability risks if the fire gets out of control and crosses a property border. So, if you wanted probably the simplest fix to do that, California could adopt the rule that Florida has, where Florida basically exempts private property owners from prescribed fire liability if it crosses property lands, unless they act with gross negligence. And that's a change. And actually, one thing I want to flag, because we haven't talked about the comparative context, you want to look at a part of the country where prescribed fire has worked quite well and has been relatively effective. It's the southeastern United States, particularly Florida, where there's a long history of prescribed fire by people, including European settlers after European contact. And local and state governments have generally advanced it and encouraged it, and it's been quite effective. The only other thing I would just say is the challenge of different ecosystems. Much of what's called the state responsibility area, the SRA, which is the area outside of federal ownership, but also outside of cities, sort of where the state fire agency, CAL FIRE, has primary responsibility. A lot of those are actually different kinds of ecosystems than the kinds of Sierra forests that Scott talked about. These are oak woodlands, these are chaparral that have different fire systems. They do need to burn, but they're going to burn in different ways. And it's not clear that, for instance, active management will do much about it. Chaparral is going to burn, and it's going to burn at high intensity. And that's just what chaparral generally does. And so the challenge there is you got to have the fire, but you got a subdivision right next door. That's a really hard thing to do, especially if you got Santa Ana winds coming in. So Scott, anything you would add to that?
No, thank you. I mean, I really agree with many points, Eric, you brought up. The Southeast being the prescribed fire capital of the United States. It certainly is. And a couple of things are happening in this state, which we're actually learning from the Southeast. There's a curriculum right now being developed in California to get certification for anybody that wants to be a prescribed fire boss. So you could be a federal person, a state person, or a private person. And it turns out in the Southeast, 75% of prescribed fire is done by private individuals on private land. That's pretty astonishing. So that curriculum is being developed. I think it's going to be brought out in about March of 2021. That was by a law, SB 1260. The other thing I think is possibly ties to this too is just the workforce that maybe I mentioned before. Senator Feinstein's bill asks for a prescribed fire training center to be built somewhere in the Western US based on a competitive process, something similar to the Tallahassee, Florida training center that exists today. And Senator Wyden's bill, the Prescribed Fire Act for the United States, actually also asks for a prescribed fire training center out here in the Western US. He kind of points it at both the Forest Service and Park Service. I think it should be competitive because I think both those entities in the West don't really have a lot of experience in that. So those are really good ideas, Eric. I think of just how you facilitate this movement, and how do we move that in from a policy realm. I think there's a lot to be done because I think there's incentives and systems that just need to go forward to help us address these issues.
The next question, can you give us a broad estimate of the financial cost of managing forests in California to attain sustainability?
Scott? I think we're talking a lot. We're talking a lot.
Yeah, you are. I mean, that is a great question. And it's a question that is absolutely challenging. If you look at prescribed fire costs, and if you do this maybe at scales that are moderate to large, you're talking about maybe a unit 5,000 acres, 10,000 acres. If you're doing that kind of area, you're probably looking at maybe $100 an acre, maybe less, 50 to 100. Eric mentioned this wildfire management in remote areas. So you get a lightning fire in a remote area, allow it to burn with careful monitoring. I've seen numbers on that for the Park Service, $25 to $40 an acre. Mechanical systems can be expensive, just as Eric said. Depends on, the thing about the mechanical system is so important. It used to be a lot of times foresters and restoration folks would look at a stand. A lot of foresters would think about the forest and what can you actually obtain from it to develop things like products, right? Wood, we need wood. But when you go in there with a restoration idea, you think about what do I want to leave? what's here that I want to leave and enhance, and then we'll take other stuff out, right? So you're going to be looking just totally opposite. You want that restoration focus of what you want to leave and then looking forward. And if you do that in a lot of places, it's going to be costly because, again, you want to leave the larger trees. There are places you could probably break even in forest, but oak woodlands and all these other places, mixed hardwood forest, my goodness, that's not the case. So I'm afraid I probably can't give you a number, but I would agree it's in the billions and billions. And the other thing, it has to happen, and you got to maintain it. That's what indigenous cultures have told us so clearly. It's about stewardship and the land forever. It literally is a conversation with the land that never ends. But the maintenance cost, once you get into a pretty good condition, is going to be much less than the operational cost originally.
Patrick, anything to add? Last question, I think. I think we're ready for the next one.
Okay, let me go to the next question. As to Scott's workforce comment, do we need a state like National Guard or draft for fire service to marshal the labor we need?
I'd be happy to comment, and I think both of our colleagues here would probably say, I think there's this idea right now of a corps, an environmental corps that might be created that could actually deal with things like climate mitigation, fire mitigation. I think it's a ripe idea. I do think that we need a workforce that can do this. Some colleagues have actually wondered if the community college system in California might help facilitate this with some courses and maybe degree programs, associate science degrees. So I think it's a ripe time to think about it. Of course, I know we've got deficits and all sorts of problems, but maybe the colleagues can comment about this.
Eric or Patrick, anything on that question?
No, nothing to add.
I mean, I will say we've got a large, in California, we have CAL FIRE, which is thousands and thousands of people working on fire, but they're dedicated to putting fires out. And I think one of the challenges here is getting the public entities that are involved with fire to think more broadly. And this is not a new problem. This, if you go back and look at the history, this has been an issue since the 70s. People have been talking about how do we shift the bureaucracy, the political context to make it difference. And it's just super hard. And I think, just to give you an example, next time you look at news coverage of fires, look at the language that the journalists use to describe it. They use military language, attacking the fire, devastating fires, fires that are on the advance, putting people to retreat, military terminology, the language of fire suppression. And you won't generally, it's starting to get a little better, but most of the coverage will not talk about the importance of fire in the landscape or whether this fire is important, beneficial, or what have you. And, you know, I get it, because in part because I lived through that smoke too. It's really hard to be in that smoke. And it's also really scary, the risk that people's houses might burn down and people whose lives might be put at risk. And so I don't have an easy answer to it, but I just would flag that even if you created a new corps, is it going to be people who will do what we need in terms of land management as opposed to fire suppression? And maybe we need to create something independent of the firefighting agencies to do that. But then the challenge is, Patrick showed those numbers. How do you get legislative or governmental buy-in or private entity buy-in to do that on an ongoing basis at the amounts that we need? And that's just been extremely difficult to get traction on.
I think that we're out of the time. I so want to thank Scott and Patrick and Eric for the terrific presentation on this topic of enormous importance. I want to wish all of you a healthy, meaningful, restful Thanksgiving holiday, and we'll resume these programs in January when the new semester starts. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.